All right. So we're going to do with Metaphysics Part 2. Let me just grab my iPad. Before we begin, I did want to mention a couple books. So I mentioned a few books in our last session on metaphysics. And I wanted to give some more recommendations in terms of books on metaphysics. Because we are going to be continually using J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig's text, a philosophical foundations for a Christian worldview. But if you want something that's more, that is going to be more advanced, so I recommended The Atlas of Reality, a comprehensive guide to metaphysics, which is Robert C. Coons, and the second author is Timothy Pickavance, who teaches at Biola. So I recommended that one. And then the second work that I didn't get to recommend, which I believe does a great job at summarizing complex ideas without being simplistic, is going to be Michael J. Laux and Thomas P. Crisp, 4th edition, Metaphysics, a Contemporary Introduction. And I know Dean Zimmerman and others, prominent metaphysicians, have helped in the 4th edition, given them remarks on how to make it more accessible. So I recommend those two works. And then I know that there's a lot of other books available. I was trying to think through that. There was some other ones. Another one that I've neglected to mention that I do have is Aquinas' Ontology of the Material World, Change, Hylomorphism, and Material Objects. So Jeffrey Brower. But more than that, Cambridge has these element series that they've been putting out. And so they actually had one that was released recently. See if I can get it. It is, I just had it up. It's quite frustrating that I can't see it here. See if I can access it, because the author escapes me. Let's see. I know Koslicki, I think her name's Catherine, but I could be mistaken. She has some helpful things to say as well, some of her papers, but there's a new book that just came out. It's called Substance. And then there was one on relations as well, and those have been very helpful. The one on relations, I can give you his name. I think it's H-E-I-R. Let's see. It's in the Cambridge series. So Cambridge series, it's Elements. And I read through the manuscript. It's short. John Heil, H-E-I-L. And the book is entitled Relations. And then there's another one on substance. And I can't get the authors up, but just look up Cambridge Elements series and then look up substances. All right? So those are some more resources to look in and dive into. So let's go through, kind of summarize what we covered. I know last time we went through the material quickly, and I didn't get an opportunity to go through perhaps more in depth on some things. So let's do that now. Let's do that here. Let's pull up my notes. Okay. Here we go. All right. All right, so let me just take off my All right, so we said existence. So this has to do with categories, right? And that's why we discussed the genus. Now, existence, we talked about existence entering into the predication of exemplification, relation, belonging to some property, or the being belonged to by a property, entering into the nexus of exemplification. And we quoted from J.P. Moreland on that. And then I was trying to explain what exemplification is, this idea of being an instance of something or an exemplification, an instantiation. So it's when a property is had. A property or a substance is had by an owner, by a property bearer. So it's something that's actually in reality. It's not merely possibly in reality. It is in fact real. So it's where a property is had by someone. And so it is exemplified by someone or something. Right? So that's this idea of exemplification. And so existence, so being, everything that has existence or everything that has existence or being in the same sense. So that's what being is, existence. We've already covered that. But it's this idea that you affirm, you predicate about something, you affirm it to exist, right? And you say that that thing, whatever it is, has or bears a property. It has a property. It possesses a property. And in sentences, we typically talk about, like this sentence right here, the dog is brown. So you have a subject and a predicate. So typically when we have a predicate, and then we have the copula, so we're saying that this dog is brown. And so we're making an affirmation. We're saying that there is something to it. And merely stating it doesn't make it so, obviously. But when we do say something, when we do make an affirmation, it's true. And so it's exemplified. It's actually real, right? It has an extra mental existence. Then we talked about a genus, a classification of being. And something related to that is a kind. So I lumped kind in right here. So a kind is more like a genus in metaphysics, specifically Neo-Aristotelian metaphysics. A kind is a species or a genus in which a thing belongs to. And typically it's something that is similar to a abstract entity in the sense that a kind is something that a being falls under, right? It's not merely a classification that we make up, but it's something that it's like a species. You can think of it in terms of like species. So it's something that naturally flows. So what that thing is, it seems like a kind determines that is what that thing is. And then a substance. And I'm going to borrow this term substance from Paul M. Gould. So Paul Gould says, a substance is a fundamental unity of parts, properties, and powers ordered for the sake of the entity's proper functioning. So it's something that's fundamental. So that means that the whole grounds the parts. Fundamentality typically means that it's something there's an asymmetrical relationship in which the whole asymmetrically grounds the parts and not vice versa. So there's not a symmetrical relation between the substance and its parts, right? The owner of the substance and all of its parts or properties or powers. So it's fundamental, it's non-derived. It's not something derived from its parts or properties, but it's fundamental. So substance is fundamental. And then we talked about mereology, not Mariology, but mereology, which is part-whole relations. We talked about A proper part is a distinct part from the whole. And then an improper part, a part that is identical to the whole. You think of a fist, right? A fist. You think of a fist. When I make a fist, it's identical to my hand, right? Even though it's a fist. Now I have a flat, open-handed is identical to my hand. A fist is identical to my hand, right? So it's considered improper part. Relations are taken as entities that can relate at least two things together at the same time. And the relation, I've discussed causal relations, grounding relations. We can go into that deeper, but I think cause and effect is a helpful relation. Yeah, I put here asymmetrical, symmetrical, yeah, different types of relations. Properties or attributes. So here, properties or attributes. So they're characteristics. So they characterize a particular entity, a particular thing. So they're characteristics, ways, or modifications possessed or owned by a substance. Properties are they adhere or inhere substances. So properties are they adhere or inhere substances. And then we've talked about this, and it was, perhaps I didn't make it clear, but this distinction between universal and particular, or abstract versus concrete. So as it's related to properties, right? As it's related to properties, so a universal or abstract property, it's an object. It's typically taken as partial. It does not exhaust its content. And it's repeatable or shareable. Typically construed as immaterial, non-spatial, and eternal. Right? And this is where the distinction between realists and nominalists, and even conceptualists, is going to be very important. So what makes two entities have the same property? So if you have two red apples, they share a property, redness. So where does that property come from? Is it merely in the apples? Do the properties merely adhere in the apples and that's it? Or do those properties exist outside of our time and space, in a realm, right? The realm would be, typically it's called Plato's heaven, right? But it's a realm that God created where all these properties exist, right? The conceptualist is going to say that these properties are ideas in the mind of God, and that God used it as a blueprint to create the universe. Whereas a nominalist is going to say properties, they either just simply adhere in a specific object, or it's merely conceptual in the sense that it's something that we've abstracted in our minds, and it's merely in our heads. It's merely epistemic, but there is no real metaphysical existence to these properties. So universal abstract, so an object that is repeatable or shareable, right? And then a particular or a concrete. Typically, it's an object or property that wholly exhausts its content. It occupies a single spatial location at a given time. So it's something that it doesn't exist beyond that specific location in space. And so for the nominalist, they're going to say when you see two human beings next to each other, they're two completely different human beings. They have some similarities, but the similarities are merely in our minds. and they're not the same. What makes them the same is the word that we use. The word when we say human to identify and lump things into classes, but that's all it is. It's just words and our mental concepts that we've made up to apply to things. It's kind of a helpful way, a convention for us to be able to identify things. So we put them into categories. So that's the nominalist way of seeing it. And again, this is not exhaustive. Now, the distinction between abstract and concrete is typically made by causal powers. So abstract things have no causal powers. They don't exert any powers. So they don't cause things. Whereas concrete things, they cause things. They have powers, like a human being, right? Humanness cannot cause anything, but a human can cause things. Hopefully that's a helpful distinction. There's a distinction that Aristotle uses between essential and accidental properties. So essential is something that in which a thing must have it in order for it to be what it is. So a common example would be, a cheeseburger. If you have a cheeseburger without cheese is not a cheeseburger, right? What is essential to a cheeseburger is cheese. Or a triangle. What is essential to a triangle, the properties that are essential for a triangle are 3 sides or 3 angles, right? But something that's non-essential, humans are born on planet Earth, but it's not essential that humans are born on planet Earth. Humans could be born in outer space. If we got a whole bunch of, we got a colony made in Mars or something like that, we could, theoretically have someone be born outside of or off of Earth, right? So a non-essential property would be a property of being born on planet Earth for human beings. Propositions. So propositions, I didn't get to cover it. So propositions are, if you read Richard Swinburne, he's going to say that they're basically statements, but they are, so it's a subject and a predicate that is a declarative sentence. So it communicates a truth in a declarative sentence that is either true or false. So that's what a proposition is. And a proposition is typically taken as something that's immaterial, that's an abstract object, right? That's immaterial, that's eternal, that is spaceless. So, and why that is, we don't have time to go into it, but so propositions. And then the last thing that we covered was a person. And I wanted to give you, so Aquinas, in his Compendium of Theology, Aquinas gives a definition of a person. He basically uses Boethius' definition. Let me just pull it up here. I don't have it. So he says a person, subsistent thing in an intellectual nature. So a person is a subsistent thing in an intellectual nature. Similar to Boethius, Boethius uses a couple terms that are not clearly defined that can be used, that can be equivocated. I think he uses the term substance or nature or essence, and those terms need to be defined to clearly make sure that we understand what Boethius means. So that's how Aquinas defines a person. I mentioned that a person is typically understood by some philosophers as either a relation or a mode. Now, mode would be treated much like a property, but a person is a substance, right? When I define substance from Paul M. Gould, we've defined a substance, and so a person is a substance, right? So a person is an individual self who possesses a first-person perspective, a thinking thing with an intellect, will, and emotions. Or more modestly, a person is one who has the capacity, if exercised, for rationality, self-knowledge, and phenomenology. So introspection, right? And these are not merely epistemic, because you have to have the ontological grounding to be able to have these epistemic virtues, right? So that's why an intellect, will, and emotions would typically be understood as something that is ontological. But as we heard from Aquinas, it's going to be a subsistence of a rational nature. I mean, those are helpful. Try and get at what is very difficult to provide a definition. So typically all the definitions that are given are going to be rough definitions. They're going to be imprecise. They're going to be somewhat vague. So what I want to do now is so we've talked about some of the debates within metaphysics. So let's take metaphysics and apply it to theology, if we can do that now. Let's take metaphysics and apply it to theology now. Now, typically we would go into the Trinity, but the Trinity is going to take me more time to get into it, but if you want to get into the Trinity, I'm right now reading some of the different papers on the Trinity. And so perhaps once I finish my study on the Trinity, we can go into the doctrine of the Trinity as it's related to metaphysics. But for the purposes of right now, we'll get into another subject that's quite complex. All right, sorry guys. Okay, so let's do the metaphysics. Okay, so we're gonna do metaphysics of the incarnation, right? It's going to be quite brief. So before we